Welcome to this episode of Unraveling Adoption, an intentional space to delve into adoption's complexities together. I'm Beth Syverson. I'm an adoptive mom of a justice-seeking 20-year-old son, Joey, who is struggling to find his path. I'm walking beside him while working on my own personal growth and healing. Joey and I are committed to helping anyone impacted by adoption, and we want to help the general public understand adoption's complexities better too. I'm also a certified coach helping seekers who want to move their lives forward. Now, listeners, I don't normally talk about politics in our Unraveling Adoption space. I know there are families who listen to this podcast that have widely diverse political views, plus there are listeners from all over the world who tune in. But today, I want to take Taylor Swift's example and use this platform to encourage other Americans to vote in the upcoming presidential election and to encourage folks to vote for Kamala Harris. The stakes are just too high to play it safe. This particular election seems like it intersects with many aspects of adoption and high-level issues that will affect our country deeply, namely racial issues, especially for our transracial adoptees, women's reproductive freedom, LGBTQ plus rights, and the small item of the continuation of our democratic systems. Just that little thing. This election, the first one for Joey to vote in, is an existential imperative for our country, and how we all show up this time will impact our world for many generations to come. Well, with me today is Mark. He's a transracial adoptee from Korea who has been a leader in adoption spaces for decades, and on his personal social media is an outspoken Democrat. I've learned so much from him by reading his informative posts. In fact, I thought he was at the Democratic National Convention because his posts were I thought he was sitting in the front row. He was just watching TV and paying very close attention and writing about it beautifully. So I asked him to come on to discuss this multi-level intersection of politics and adoption. We are leaving off Mark's last name, but many of you in the adoption community might know who this amazing man is, especially if you're in the transracial adoption world. This episode will be a bit of a coming out by two gay Democrats who care deeply about our country and about people impacted by adoption. We hope to encourage those who've lost hope in our electoral system to vote this time around. And if anyone is possibly, I don't know how you could be, but if you're still undecided, we hope today's episode will help you confirm your choice for this election. Welcome to this episode of Unraveling Adoption, Mark. I'm so glad you're here with me.
Thank you, Beth. It's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's unravel this political piece that rarely gets discussed in the adoption spaces we inhabit. Why did you say yes when I asked you to talk about politics with me at this time in our history?
So I am in a really interesting headspace these days, Beth. I was born in 1960. I was adopted as an infant by white American parents of Northern European descent, and I grew up in Wisconsin. When I was growing up in the 1960s and 1970s, which I know seems like the Pleistocene era, but anyway, in the social milieu or environment I grew up in, the idea was that you should never talk about politics, right?
Mm-hmm.
You never talked about sex, politics, or bodily functions. Those were like the three rules, right? And especially not at the dinner table. And I grew up in that environment, but I've been on multiple journeys in my life. One is as an adult transracial and international adoptee related to being a person of color. And the other is as a gay man.
Mm-hmm.
And for me right now, we're looking at a situation in this country, in the United States, where we're correct in your introduction. This is an existential election for us.
Mm-hmm.
So at least on a personal level, I feel I need to speak up and speak out. I have three marginalized identities. I'm an immigrant because I was not born in this country. I was naturalized. I'm a person of color, and I am a gay man. And I don't know if people know this. I don't want to dive into the deep end right away, but one of the elements in this Project 2025, and if you're not familiar, please familiarize yourself with it. Yes.
That's scary.
But one element specifically is the idea that it should be possible legally to strip naturalized citizens of their citizenship.
Oh my gosh.
So that would be me, right?
Oh.
And I mean, who knows whether this would ever happen or not, but we are in a situation now where, we're being forced to look at very kind of apocalyptic potentialities.
Yep.
So that's why I'm speaking out now. And all of this relates for me to coming out of a number of different fogs. We talk about the fog and adoption. And there are actually several fogs here that I would cite. There's the fog of adoption. And related to that, as a transracial adoptee, the fog of whiteness, growing up in near total whiteness. Another fog for me was coming out as a gay man and walking that journey as an LGBTQ person. And I don't know if this is a fog or it's just how our society was, but as I mentioned, when I was growing up, the idea was that one did not talk politics in polite society, that it was something reserved for special rooms, right? Like there were times when one could talk about politics, but only in a certain context and only, with very strict rules. Everything that is happening now is political. And when I hear people, and fortunately fewer people say this nowadays, but when I hear people say things like, I am not political, I think that's privilege.
Yes.
To be able to say, no person of color, no LGBTQ person, for that matter, no immigrant, no disabled person can say, oh, I don't need to pay attention to politics because we are affected by it. So that's why we're conversing today.
Yeah, for sure. And that's always been the case.
Yeah.
Even back in the 60s and 70s when we all just didn't talk about it. The personal is always political.
Yeah.
But it seems like we can't avoid it any longer. We're coming to this head and we have to reckon with it.
Yeah.
So this is America's Great Reckoning. I am slightly terrified of how it's going to turn out.
Right.
And I don't want to get to the other side of this election and say, I didn't do everything I could do. So this is one of the ways I'm trying to help spread the word.
Yeah. And what I would say, Beth, is I am very glad to speak up in the context of being a member of the transracial adoption community. I think that for us transracial adoptees, there are layers here.
Definitely.
There are layers as transracial adoptees and or international adoptees, whether you're one or the other or both. And I'm both. Yep. Those of us who were in the early waves of international adoption and the early waves of transracial adoption, we were essentially raised to be white. I was in the first wave of Korean adoption, which was the first wave of international adoption. And they basically just handed the babies or children to the white parents and said, there you go. You got a child now. I mean, my parents did an amazing job considering there were zero resources. But where I'm headed with that is all of the adoptee friends I know who were in that first wave were raised not only in overwhelmingly white spaces, but in overwhelming whiteness, meaning they had no access to any cultural or social settings or contexts that were not totally white dominated. And so for many of us, we'd emerge out of the fog of whiteness.
Yes.
And I always say I was raised to be white, but I was not allowed to be white.
Okay. Oof. That's profound.
Yeah. Well, it's the cognitive dissonance I grew up in, and so many of us grew up in. So I hope that explains some things.
Yeah, it does. It's very important for us to hear, especially white people, to hear the voices of the transracial adoptees and how being a person of color, but a different type of person of color, you're in a very unique situation. What is it like to see one of the presidential candidates as a person of color?
Yeah, I'm thrilled. Yeah. I think for me, I have mixed emotions, and let me explain why. I'm thrilled that we have a woman of color. She is the first Black woman and the first South Asian person to run for president. So I'm absolutely thrilled, full stop. What's hard is that she is having so much racism and misogyny thrown at her. And in the context of being a Black woman, I love the use of the term misogynoir to describe what happens to Black women specifically.
Yes, I've heard that.
And so I'm thrilled about her candidacy, and she's a wonderful candidate. But there is the mixed emotion all of us with marginalized identities feel when we know that the person who shares one or more of our marginalized identities is going to be attacked for their identity.
Yeah.
Right. So that's
that must make you a little nauseous just to go, oh crap, this is going to come up, and it comes up every single day. There's something thrown at her.
It comes up every single day, and I'll just plunge into the deep end of the pool. To have her constantly be ridiculed and mocked for her identity and called names that are racist and sexist, right?
Yeah.
We use the term other and othering. Mm-hmm. When you make someone feel bad about themselves by pointing out their difference, right? Mm-hmm. Like you're the only redhead in the room. Let's other you. Let's say, oh, look how crazy that is. This person is a ginger or whatever. Mm-hmm. So when that happens, it's very triggering for us because, well, for one thing, it reminds us of our own being othered. Mm-hmm. So I'm thrilled at the candidate, and I think she's a wonderful candidate, but, it brings up a lot of stuff because, unfortunately, again, this speaks to the whole issue of coming out of the fog of whiteness. Mm-hmm. White people who grow up in the fog of whiteness and never leave the fog of whiteness. And not everyone is like that. Many white people have left that fog. But if you're still stuck in the fog, it all seems very strange, right? Because racism in that context is some individual transgression by an individual that is offensive, right? Okay. Mm-hmm. Calling a Black person the N-word. Like you individually did a wrong thing that is bad. Mm-hmm. And what people, and for some people it isn't even bad, but that's another whole issue. But as opposed to understanding that we live with systemic racism in our society. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that this presidential candidate's candidacy is bringing up for people is the extent to which racism still exists in this country.
Oh, okay. You're still seeing white people being shocked, like, oh, what?
They're shocked. And in many cases, they are so embedded in whiteness that they don't want to use your term, unravel, right? They don't want to unravel or unspool their own inherent bias. Right. So they might come up with all sorts of not intellectually honest reasons for opposing her, or it might simply be too difficult, so they don't want to think about it. And yet they would never question their biases and they won't vote for her. Right. So it's it's a whole web of things put together.
Yeah. White people, we need to do our work. I think that I've heard you endorse the book White Fragility.
Yes, I love it.
And that was very helpful for me. I think I now try to go toward people of color's writing, but it's a great entry point for those of us that are clueless. That's a great place to start. If you haven't dug into this yet, white people, go read White Fragility.
Well, and I just have to say something, and I'm not going to get any commission or anything, but Robin DiAngelo is fabulous. And there was a debate when her book came out, or a discussion among some people of color. And it went something like this. Oh, this is terrible. Why should a white woman benefit by writing this book? It should have been a Black person, or at least a person of color of some race, non-white. And what I said, and they're wonderful, many now wonderful books written by Black and brown people. Mm-hmm. How many white people read them? Like, it's minuscule. And so what I said, they needed a quote unquote nice white lady to explain all this to them. And even so, I have had friends and acquaintances whom I had to handhold.
Okay. White people, you mean?
Yeah, white people, yes. Okay. Of course, whose hands I had to hold because they were so freaked out. I'll mention one person, of course, zero names here. Of course. But someone who I was connected to through a mutual friend, and we've become good friends over time. And she had started Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility and was freaked out by it. And I want to be clear, it wasn't that she resisted it. She wasn't like, oh, this is nonsense, I can't stand this. Mm-hmm. No, she agreed with the premise, but it was so hard for her to read the book that she had put it down. Yeah. So I walked her through it And over time, she picked it up, and then she was able to read it
Okay.
and spin around and dance and everything. But what I found funny was how, for us, people of color, every person of color I know who read that book, they turned the page, read a page, okay, read another page, okay. And every white person, or most white people I know, they turned the page, started reading, gasped,
Oh shit! What?
They needed the
I have to change
smelling
everything.
salts,
Oh no!
right? Yeah, needed the smelling salts to
Yeah.
revive, and then went on. And the funny thing about that is, this is what we people of color grow up with and live with
All the time, every day.
To all my very dear friends of color, I have said it took a white woman to write it because that's whom white people could listen to.
Yeah, for sure. And whatever gets you into the conversation, just get into it. However you can do it. It's all good. It's such an important piece of this because the racism is just so blatant. It's just constant in this election and in our culture, and it has to be addressed. We cannot just sit back and just let it happen. It's horrible.
Right. It's all connected. Mm-hmm. When you look at the support for the Republican Party right now, what is the core support? It's really based on race, racial identity,
That's really it.
And people being threatened. Within 40 years, we're going to be a majority minority country. Mm-hmm. So we'll have majority of people of color. And I know that there are many, many white people who are very threatened by that. Yeah. Some are so threatened they can't even express it.
Wow.
Right? Mm-hmm. And if you look at the qualifications and the qualities, personal qualities and capabilities, there should be no question about who you would vote for. Yeah. But the irony is that many right-wingers in this country will say, well, those liberals play identity politics. Mm-hmm. Well, we just field candidates who don't happen to be older white heterosexual men sometimes. Yeah. And that is deeply upsetting to people. Yeah. And it's all connected because the moderate version of the Republican Party that existed 10 years ago is dead.
There's nothing left of that.
There's nothing left of it. Mm-mm. And there are people, and I want to be very, very clear, there are many people in this country who still, to some extent, identify as Republicans on a personal level, mm-hmm. who are decent people, who are not racist. However, they've basically been pushed out of that party now. And that's another reason to speak out, because what is left is extremist. Mm-hmm. And again, it's related to Project 2025, yeah. which has so many terrible elements, but the core is anti-immigrant. Mm-hmm. And the authors of Project 2025 put it right out there. They want to push out all undocumented people in this country. First of all, even if you completely set aside the humanitarian aspects, that would be an economic disaster for our country. Who are the maids in our hotels, right? Yeah. Like they're almost all undocumented workers. We would have no housekeeping in hotels. But
yeah. See how long that lasts.
But the core issue there is, who are we including and excluding? And that's why I am always, and there are people of color who need help getting more woke too. There are a lot of them.
Sure.
But I feel right now is a time to speak out and to be clear.
Yeah.
We no longer have the luxury. This is an existential election, as you pointed out. We no longer have the luxury of politeness, yeah. In the old-fashioned sense. I do remember my childhood. I remember how it was considered impolite, again, except in very specific contexts, like maybe you would go off to your debating society or something like that.
There you go. Yeah.
But in the normal social context, it was considered impolite to talk about politics. Well, we've had generations of people raised that way, and look what has happened.
Yeah.
We also have had generations of people raised who actually literally don't understand the history of the United States. Mm-hmm. So I think one thing that some of us who are transracial and or international adoptees can do, we can hold up kind of a mirror mm-hmm. to our society and say, this is what it's really like. I was told the entire time I was growing up, I don't see race. right? Like everyone said, I don't see race.
Yep.
It was obvious to me they saw race. I mean, the kids who taunted and ridiculed me, that, there were so many ways in which I could see that race was a paramount issue.
Mm-hmm. They weren't telling other white kids, I don't see your race. They were telling it to you.
They were telling it to me, yeah. And that's kind of the thing about being raised in near total whiteness, as I was, that I internalized racism towards myself. And that's taken a very long time to work through a lot of issues. And for a transracial adoptee raised by white parents in whiteness, and it's somewhat different now for many families in 2024 than it was in 1961 when I arrived. Although amazingly, there are transracial adoptees 2, 3, 4 years old who are still being raised in near total whiteness. Now, for many, it's different, but it is devastating for us to be raised in total or near total whiteness. Yes. And I know adoptees who still have not made their way out of the fog of whiteness or the fog of adoption. And they end up in very, very tiny social spaces, usually family, and then a tiny cluster of close friends whom they can trust. Because if they haven't moved out of those spaces, both literally and figuratively, they are experiencing racism. And so their comfort zone gets smaller rather than larger. The only way to shift that is to find friends of color, and to move into a colorized world.
Yeah, to expand instead of contract. Wow. Yeah, that's really tough. So besides the race piece, which is huge, are there other types of ways that adoption intersects with politics? What other effects for adoptees particularly could you imagine with this election?
Well, here's another thing. The white parents who have adopted and raised or are raising children of color, they very well might be voting against their children's interests as people of color.
Absolutely.
Right. And their family members and relatives and their neighbors. So it's all related, because no human, unless they're living in a cave in the woods or something, is completely alone. They're interacting with people. And we need to speak out. And I'll add in my other identity as a gay man. I think it's really important for LGBTQ people who can to speak out, to be present.
Yes.
Silence will kill us. And I think that for many of us who are of color, what I realized, it took me years. It was a very, very long unspooling, a very long journey. But I realized that had I stayed in the social environment in which I was raised, even with very loving parents, it would have been devastating for me across a lifetime. So this is all related, because we need to mobilize people. And to do that, we first need to educate people. And to do that, we have to engage with them. Now, I don't ever want to put more responsibility on anyone else. But what I will say is that we transracial adoptees have an incredible opportunity, potentially, because we were raised in whiteness. We speak white. We speak the language of whiteness. I know white people, and so we can speak to them in ways that, for example, an immigrant person of color can't, right? It's not a matter of ability. It's a matter of background. I would summarize by saying we're not just individuals. We're potential advocates. We're potential activists. And a lot of people are immediately frightened when they hear the word activist. They picture someone, in a demonstration or even a riot or something, and they imagine conflict and confrontation. The most simple activism is having a conversation with a neighbor.
Yeah.
That's activism.
That might be even more scary.
Yes. Well, yeah, it could be. Yeah.
That's it. Just talk to your friends, make sure they're registered to vote, make sure they're engaged in the process. Because I bet a lot of people have just given up and just said, none of it matters. Doesn't matter anyway.
People are exhausted also. We've gone through years of just exhausting politics, and I understand that.
Yep, it's traumatizing. Yeah.
It's traumatizing. I'm thinking of one close friend. All of her instincts are good. Her politics is very good. But day to day, she just doesn't want to hear about it at all. And I understand she is going to vote correctly and all that. So that's okay. I understand. But here's the thing. She and I have conversations all the time. And I try to gently encourage her to speak up and out, because she has a lot of people in her life who are either right wing or somewhat conservative. And she's someone who is non-threatening to them, right?
Oh, okay.
So if someone turns on the TV and sees someone who is instantly threatening to a person, the person will shut down. Oh my gosh, that's this crazy, scary, radical. And My friend, who knows a lot of people on the other side, has the potential to do some persuasion. Now, is she going to change a million people's minds? No. But in this election, and she knows people in key swing states.
Yeah, in certain states, it matters deeply, each person.
You're right. Literally, in the last 2 presidential elections, and then that's not to even mention the midterms, but in 2016 and 2020, states turned on 7,000, 10,000, 11,000 votes. Yeah. And when you have a state with 10 million people or more that turns on 10,000 votes, that's a tiny number of people.
Yeah.
And literally every vote counts. I cannot remember which election it was. It was a local election, I think for mayor, that literally turned on 1 vote.
Whoa.
Right? Like the candidate who won, and they had to do a recount and everything, literally won by 1 vote.
Yeah.
So every vote really does count. And I just feel a moral obligation. And I'll never put that on anyone else. I'll never put an obligation on anyone else. But as an adult transracial and international adoptee and a lifelong student of history and politics and all those things, I feel that to whatever extent I have any abilities, I do need to use those to persuade. Sometimes it's also persuading people on our side, people who might be dispirited or discouraged, like discouraged voters, right? And say, look, this election is important. This is why you should vote. Yeah. These are positive reasons to vote, not just negative. Yeah. And so honestly, it's all connected. We are faced with an unbelievably stark series of choices here. Yeah. And the 2 presidential candidates, the 2 parties across Congress and state legislatures are so far apart that to say that there's no choice is ridiculous, right? Yeah. They're like from 2 different planets in the solar system. Totally. Right. And so my feeling is this. The bottom line is, if I have a voice and I can reach a small number of people and I can help them to see what the issues really are and help them to understand things in a more awakened context, I feel I have the obligation to do that.
I share that obligation with you. I feel that for myself, like you said, telling anyone else what to do except to vote. But we all need to use whatever power we have, whether it's just to talk to your family members, to talk to your kids' friends that are turning 18 any minute here, or, to just help keep this country afloat.
Yes.
It's not a trivial thing. It's this major turning point. We have an option for a major turning point in our country.
Yeah.
And I think especially as an adoptive parent of a person of color, if you have anyone in your family that's a person of color, if you have any LGBTQ people in your family, if you have any women in your family that might want to have some sort of reproductive freedom, that intersects with adoption greatly. Our choices for reproduction and
Yeah, and if I may say, Beth, I also think that transracially adopted parents have a special niche, right? You can speak to another transracially adopted mom and you can say, look, we both have kids of color. What is important for them? It's important to live in a society that isn't racist. Yes. It's important for them to have equal opportunity. it's important for them not to be persecuted for their race.
Yeah. Or at risk of being deported. I mean, this happens to adoptees, literally.
Yeah.
Or to feel othered,
Right.
even if they don't get deported. But that feeling of feeling othered is like a human right violation. You can't do that to people.
Here we are in the year 2024, and we have made progress compared to, when I was born, certainly 1960. But every bit of progress that we make in terms of racial equality in this country is like pushing a boulder up a hill.
Yeah.
So again, this is all related. It's a terrible thing that people are falsely accusing immigrants from Haiti of eating people's dogs and cats. And it's a terrible thing to say and ridiculous. But it's a quote unquote good example of what we're up against.
Yes.
That there are people who believe this, that there are people who are spreading the lie. Mm-hmm. And so back to your being an adoptive mom and my being an adoptee, we can bring these things up to people. Mm-hmm. And the way that we can do a little bit of jujitsu with something like that is by saying to your friend, did you hear about this? Isn't that ridiculous? And then drilling a little deeper and saying, they would never say that about Norwegian or Swedish immigrants, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what does that say about us? And the fact that we have still in this country tremendous unquestioned bias.
For sure.
And I just feel an obligation to challenge it. Mm-hmm. And I know many friends of color who are so traumatized by everything that's happened. Mm-hmm. They do just kind of want to crawl into a cave. And I understand that.
No doubt.
And I'm empathetic to a certain extent, but I also would say the only way we're going to get out of this situation in this country is so much polarization. And the only way we're going to get to the next level, where we're really starting to remove some level of racism, as well as xenophobia, homophobia, misogyny, all the things, mm-hmm. is if we talk about it. Mm-hmm. And I really do think having the little conversation with your elderly aunt or your neighbor or your coworker or whatever, that can actually be the most persuasive thing you can do because they know you.
Yeah,
right?
It's really effective.
Your next door neighbor, you say, hi, how have you been? And you end up talking and then you can help that person peel apart the layers a little bit. Again, I'll just say the word activist and activism is very threatening to many people. As soon as they hear it, they think radical and they think, burning buildings down or something like that. I would never call myself an activist, but some might call me that in the sense that I am very active, and I do speak out in certain forms. So we all have something we can do. Mm-hmm. And I think just because of my 3 different marginalized identities, certainly I'm aware of what the possibility is. I feel a sense of obligation, mm-hmm. and I feel we are kind of all in this together. Yeah. The way that fascism triumphs is if everyone goes silent and becomes quiescent.
Yep.
The way that authoritarianism triumphs is if people give way to authority unquestioningly.
Yep.
So
I know people sometimes say, if you ever wondered what the good Germans were doing when the rise of the Nazis was happening, we're in that right now.
Yeah.
Whatever you're doing is what the good Germans were doing or what the regular Germans were doing. So let's be the ones that saved the country, that saved lives, that advocated for those in more marginalized situations than you are. Because after a certain point, all of our rights are going to get stripped. So if we aren't careful. So the stakes are extremely, extremely high.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for being willing to talk about this with me on this. I'm very glad we got through the whole thing without saying that former president's name. That makes me really happy. It makes me sick to my stomach.
No, absolutely. No, I'm glad we didn't focus too much on individual personality because when we do that, people immediately kind of discount the whole conversation, right? Mm-hmm. Like you're just talking about one person. And what's going on in this country is broader than one person.
Oh, very much so. Yeah, there's way more people besides that former president that believe that same way, that are behind all of that and behind Project 2025. And we all have to do our part. So everybody, pull it together.
Yes.
And do what we can in that next couple of weeks. Get out the vote. Make sure you vote. Vote early. vote however you can do it in your state and just get it done. Well, thank you very much, Mark. And if anyone wants to get a hold of you, we're going to have them email me because we're keeping you kind of neutral and anonymous because of your job and stuff. So if anyone wants to contact Mark, just email me and I'll get the message to Mark.
I appreciate that, Beth. And thank you for doing this. I think if you reach one person through this, it will have been worth it.
Yeah.
And I just hope that whoever has listened to this podcast through to this moment will think about it in an open-minded spirit and will reflect a little bit on what they might be able to do and what this is all about. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for being willing to do this with me. I think we are both very brave, and everyone, this is the time to be brave. This is the time.
Thank you.
Thank you. So if any of you would like to get a hold of Mark, go ahead and email me at beth@unravelingadoption.com. And while you're there, go on unravelingadoption.com to find out whatever events we have coming up. We have information about our book, Adoption and Suicidality, and community calendar, Healing the Adoption Constellation Database, and much more. And let's keep the conversation going about politics in adoption. Why don't you look us up on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or LinkedIn and drop a comment, as long as it's respectful and open-minded, and we will all see if we can help make the world a little bit better place for everybody by telling our honest truths and standing up for what we believe in. Thank you all for listening. Can you do us a favor and share this episode with someone you know that might be on the fence or might be discouraged with politics right now? Someone in the adoption space that might not understand the intersections of politics and adoption. Please share the episode, and we really appreciate that. And Mark and I want you all to stay
safe.